You're listening to Speaking Sidemount, the podcast where we talk all things sidemount diving, from equipment, skills, techniques, and sidemount diving expeditions to interviews with some of the world's top sidemount divers. Whether you're new to sidemount, been sidemount diving for years, or just want to know more, this is the place for all things sidemount. I'm your host, Steve Davis. Let's get wet.
Hey, welcome back to Speaking Sidemount. I'm Steve Davis. This episode is produced with the support of our major sponsor, XDeep, and the patrons of Speaking Sidemount. Thanks so much to all of you for your enduring support. It makes all of this possible. This episode is a follow-on from the premium patron-only episode 56, which was one of my absolute favorites. Thanks so much to all of our patrons for the amazing feedback. It was awesome to be able to sit down with Steve and discuss building experience, how this plays into safely completing more challenging dives, and then dealing with it when shit goes wrong, which it invariably will at some point in your career. Steve tied it all together when he recounted his stunning dive to connect Dan and Ralph's caves in Abaco, Bahamas, where he dealt with multiple incidents while passing a no visibility, no mount, clay and mud-filled restriction. If you're not a patron of Speaking Sidemount, check out the segment that I put up on YouTube. There'll be a link in the notes. And if you want to hear the entire episode, then go to www.patreon.com/speakingsidemount. Now, as you may be aware, over the past 2 years, Steve has had it pretty tough with respect to diving. A series of DCS incidents on successive dives, each a little worse than the previous, has led Steve to hang up his fins and retire from diving. Just the thought of one of the world's great cave explorers having to quit under circumstances such as this is gut-wrenching. But to his credit, Steve has continued to be active and regularly shares enlightening posts on various topics related to sidemount, cave diving, and exploration. He still has a huge amount to share, and in this episode, Steve and I discuss his DCS incidents, what he has learned about them, his thoughts on a possible cause, his advice for professional divers, particularly those involved in day after day diving, and there's some really surprising aspects to this about shallow and sawtooth profiles. And we also go into what Steve has planned for the future. Again, my huge thanks to XDeep and all of the patrons of Speaking Sidemount, and thanks to Steve Bogaerts for sharing with all of us. Steve, welcome back to Speaking Sidemount.
Thank you very much. Good to be here. Glad to chat with you again. Enjoyed the last one. Looking forward to this one.
Yeah, it's been a while. I mean, had you on the podcast first, would you believe, in 2018, and that was episodes 3 and 4. So a lot has happened since then. We're living through, as we were just discussing, a historic pandemic, which certainly our generation's never seen anything like this before. How are you doing?
Really good. I've actually got to spend a lot of time in the UK, a lot longer than I anticipated. I had a trip planned, which happened just before the pandemic started, and I've been here several months now, but it's given me an opportunity to spend a lot more time with family and spend an extended period with my daughter. So that for me has been a really great silver lining.
Yeah, just for our listeners, Steve and I were talking off mic, and I did a similar thing. Our son came back from Barcelona and spent the lockdown here in New Zealand with us. My wife and I often reflect on what's going on right now, and we locked down for 49 days, and we quite enjoyed it. I mean, apart from no money, which really sucked, but in terms of being able to spend time with family and, let's use the word, decompress from our daily lives and the rat race that we're in and the rush and the busyness and everything, we actually really enjoyed it, and we almost miss it a little bit every now and again, that time that we had every day to do whatever we wanted to do. And it was a lot of fun in that sense, but of course, what's really going on isn't a lot of fun, and I guess we've got a lot of this in front of us.
Yeah, absolutely right. But I think the great pause, as people have called it, gives you a time maybe to reflect on what's important in your life, and what actually keeps you sort of like healthy and sane, and also where your priorities are going to be when we come out the other side of it as well.
Yeah. And normally I start these interviews with kind of an intro and get you to talk a little bit about who you are. But I mean, number one, you need no introduction. I doubt that there's anyone who listens to Speaking Sidemount who doesn't know who you are and some of your accomplishments. If you don't know, if you happen to be kind of new to this, then please go back to episode 3 or 4 and have a listen to Steve giving an introduction and his background. But Steve, I mean, after decades of being one of the world's leading cave explorers, last year everything changed for you. Can you just explain a little bit about what you went through and what led to that point?
Sure. this came out of the blue, was completely unexpected, a little bit like coronavirus. But I was basically doing what for me is a fairly routine dive. It was the last dive of a course I was finishing off with a client. And it was a comparatively easy dive. And there were no predisposing factors prior to the dive, during the dive, for why I should have got bent. But after the dive, I actually did suffer a bend. And I just put it down to statistics. If you dive for long enough, if you do enough dives, sooner or later, it's likely that you're going to have like a decompression incident for whatever reason. And as we know, decompression theory is an inexact science. It's, 1/3 science, 1/3 guesswork, 1/3 black magic. And, none of the tables, none of the computer algorithms are designed individually. And as we know, everyone's physiology differs from each other. And also your own physiology will change on a day-to-day basis. So, there could be any number of factors that cause you to step over the line from sort of like no signs and symptoms of decompression, stress, or illness into overt signs of decompression, stress, and illness. So after the dive, which was a fantastic dive, as I said, really comfortable, really enjoyable, just as I was pulling my gear out of the water, I noticed that I had some pain in my left shoulder. And to be honest, I wasn't thinking decompression, illness at that point at all. I had no reason to think that. I actually put it down to doing jiu-jitsu the day before.
A Kimura or something.
Yeah, exactly. Because particularly at my age, you get aches and pains.
Tell me about it, yeah.
And I often have sort of like aches and pains. And, I was just thought, I must have tweaked my shoulder yesterday while I was rolling and not noticed, but that was kind of sore. And I just sort of didn't think anything more about it. And to be honest, the pain went away. I drove back. I dropped my client off. I did everything. And then later that evening, that night, I started to feel actually unwell. And I still, at that point, didn't put it down to decompression illness. The course had been delayed a little bit because my client had been ill with the flu. So then I just thinking in my head, it's like, okay, damn, I've obviously caught his flu. The symptoms I had were very flu-like symptoms. So I just went to bed early and didn't have a great night and woke up the next morning. And at that point, I started to realize, okay, the symptoms I'm having now, they've changed and they don't fit flu anymore. So this could possibly be a bend. So the rebreather, I still had it with me. It was still set up, ready to go. I thought, you know what, I'm just going to breathe pure O2 off the rebreather, see if that makes any difference. And within sort of like 15 minutes, all the symptoms went. And at that point, I realized, okay, I have a bend. So I contacted the local chamber, went to the chamber, and they did an exam. Obviously found some type 1 and type 2 symptoms. The more symptoms were the neurological symptoms that I had. And I ended up having 4 treatments. First go around, I think it was 2 table 5s and a couple of table 9s. But I had full resolution of the symptoms at the end of the treatment. And, for anyone who's had a bend and had to go through recompression therapy, it's uncomfortable, it's not very pleasant, and it beats you up. So not only does the effect of the bend is a systemic effect on your body, it affects everything, but also the treatment is pretty tough on the body as well. Now, obviously, we know that oxygen is both good and bad for us. Oxygen, to a certain extent, is good for us, but high partial pressures of oxygen over extended periods of time affect pretty much every tissue, every cell in your body. And that's what recompression therapy is, basically. It's high PPO2 over an extended period of time. So I felt pretty rough after that. Even though I had full resolution of symptoms, I still felt, not great for sort of like a week after the chamber treatments. And at that point, I was advised by higher back physicians at the chamber to take a couple of weeks off from diving from the last chamber treatment. And I had a whole bunch of other medical tests done. When I went to the chamber, I had blood tests done. They did all the other routine tests they did. As far as I could see, my health was good. There were no clear reasons why I should have got the bend. So they just put it down to, well, sometimes the number comes up. You just won the lottery that day for whatever reason. So they were like, okay, yeah, you're fine, completely recovered. So take 2 weeks out of the water and then just start back. Shortly after that, my daughter was visiting. This is out in Mexico. So I actually had an extended break from the water anyway. So I was out for about a month, which I wasn't unhappy about because 2 weeks was kind of like the minimum period they said. And obviously If it's longer, that's fine. So I was actually out of the water for about a month, which I thought was probably a good idea anyway. And after she'd left, I had a client coming back in, like a repeat client, someone I know quite well who's been diving with me quite a few times before, but hadn't been cave diving out in Mexico for a while. So he'd come in to do some guided diving. We decided just to take it real easy. So we did a short sort of like refresher in the open water at a cenote. That didn't take long. He just wanted to basically get wet, check his gear out, make sure his weighting, trim and buoyancy were on point before we entered the overhead environment. So we were in the open water for like 15 minutes or so. And then we just did 2 pretty comfortable, easy cave dives. I mean, this is just swimming down the main line of Ponderosa. So, maximum depth, 15, 16 meters, like dive time was about sort of like 70, 80 minutes for both dives. There were swimming dives, but it was a pretty comfortable, easy pace. Did the first dive, felt fine, took a sort of like hour and a half. Surface interval, we had some lunch and everything, went back in, did the second dive, felt fine after that as well. And then later that evening, started again, same symptoms as last time, but didn't have the shoulder pain or anything after the dive. But subsequent to getting home, about 5-6 hours after the dive, started getting these flu-like symptoms again and contacted the chamber. I was basically in the chamber the next day. Same symptoms as last time, but slightly more severe this time, particularly the neurological symptoms. And I had, again, went through the same thing. I had 4 or 5 treatments in the chamber, but they had to extend some of the treatments because I wasn't getting full resolution of the symptoms. I did eventually, at the end of all of the treatment, I did have full resolution of the symptoms, but it took longer. The treatments themselves were longer, and I actually had more treatments to actually deal with all of the issues. So again, the doctors did the same thing. They checked me over, gave me physicals, did blood tests and everything else, couldn't find anything wrong, but said, okay, there is something, there is a problem, because the second time it's happened, and judging by the dive profiles and everything else, it shouldn't have happened. So we'd like you to have a PFO test, which at first I questioned a little bit, because after sort of 30 plus years of diving, I felt that it would be strange if a PFO just all of a sudden showed up, because the PFO is something you're born with. PFO meaning a patent foramen ovale, which is a small opening in the atrial wall of the heart, and it gets closed by a flap of skin that goes over. It allows, when you're a fetus in the womb, it allows oxygenated blood to pass to both sides of the heart and the circulation. But obviously, when you're born, there's a flap that's supposed to cover that. Now, 25% of adults have an undiagnosed PFO, which I was fully aware of. And I haven't had a PFO test previously because I've never had any issues or problems, although that is something they're sort of advising that people going into technical diving should do these days. And that does make sense because so many people do have undiagnosed PFOs. But I figured with 30 years of diving behind me and a lot of deep diving, mixed gas diving, decompression diving, that in itself is kind of a PFO test. Speaking to the doctors, I was like, well, is it likely that I have a PFO? And they said no. But as you age, as your tissues basically age as well, they can possibly stiffen, then there is a possibility that you have had an undiagnosed PFO all this time, and it's only now starting to give you issues. So we'd like you to do the test just to rule it out. And I'm like, fine, okay, let's do it. So I had a transthoracic echocardiogram, and they inject agitated saline solution and do this basically bubble test, get you to do a force field of salvo and a few other things to see if you can get a shunt of bubbles from one side of the circulation, from the venous circulation, through a PFO or potential PFO into the arterial circulation. And that test came up clear. So again, finding a reason why this was happening, it was a bit of a mystery. And to be honest, after the first bend, I wasn't really all that concerned. I just put it down to, okay, it's just statistics. It was just my unlucky day for whatever reason. The second bend, because I'd been bent before and because it was my first dive back, I was actually being pretty conservative. I was taking it really, really easy. I was making sure I was really well hydrated before and after the dive. So, I mean, I did all the right things. I mean, I was completely on point. The first time around, it was just a normal diving day. The second time around, I'm actually thinking about it and being conservative and really making sure that there's nothing in my pre-dive behavior or dive behavior that possibly caused any issues. And yet, I got bent again, and again, the symptoms were worse this second time round. So at that point, I was pretty concerned about what was going on, and obviously had the tests and did everything else, and didn't have an answer as to why I was getting bent. And they advised me to take a longer break from the water. They actually advised me, I think, to take 6 weeks out of the water, if I remember correctly. But I had a trip planned to Europe anyway at that point in time. And so I was actually out of the water for close to 3 months, in fact. Came back to Mexico, went out to do a dive. And again, a really simple, easy dive, making sure that I was on point with everything super conservative. Great dive, really enjoyed being back in the water after almost 3 months out of the water. Dived at Minotauro, did the upstream circuit. It's a maximum depth of 15 meters. Average depth for the whole dive is probably 10 meters or less. 70-minute dive at a super easy, relaxed pace. Again, no symptoms after the dive, but again, that evening, symptoms again. So another round of treatment and everything else. And again, same as the second one. This time the symptoms were stronger, they were more severe. They took longer to resolve, and they didn't resolve either. So I was still dealing with issues even after the recompression therapy had finished. I mean, they got to a point where I was getting no further improvement in my symptoms, but I wasn't back to 100% physically or mentally. I mean, it affected not just my body in a physical fashion, but it also affected my thinking ability, my cognitive ability, my balance. So quite a lot of stuff. And at that point, I'm like, okay, this is getting worse and worse and worse. I don't know what's causing it. I don't know what the reason is, but at this point, I think I have to hang my fins up. And this whole process, I mean, this took over a year. From the time where I first got bent to basically the last bend, it was basically a year in duration. And that whole year was a time where obviously wasn't able to work, didn't have any income coming in, really unsure about like how I move forward from this or if I can move forward. There was a lot of unknowns and no one could give me any clear answers. It was a pretty difficult time for me, to be honest. And, it was very difficult to plan anything or know which direction that I was going in. But after the third bend, it then became clear to me that this was something that was going to potentially, if I carry on pushing it, if I carry on getting in the water and going diving, even though I'm taking it easy and getting treatment afterwards, I could be left with permanent damage. And it took a long time. It was probably 6 months after the last bend until I felt completely 100% normal again, physically. And as I said, with some of the other neurological issues that I had that were going on. And even to this day, unsure, because you become a little bit paranoid about everything and anything. But even to this day, I still think that my balance hasn't fully recovered. It's close to being what it was, but I still think there may be some residual damage there that sometimes leads to a little bit loss of balance.
Yeah, I mean, it's heart-wrenching. And I remember seeing your post early November 2019, and this is obviously at the point that I think you're ready to announce the decision to the world that, hey, you're not going to be diving anymore. So I'm sure you made it sometime before then. And for someone of your standing and diving, for that to happen to you, I saw the outpouring that came from that in terms of the posts on there. It was tough for us. So how was it for you? I mean, I can't even imagine. That was nearly 8 months ago now that I saw that post. What's happened since then?
I honestly think it's no different for me than it would be for anybody else who was so passionate about their diving. It's a very, very difficult decision to make. It's a very difficult thing to step away from. And I struggled with that decision for quite a long time. But to be honest, the decision was taken out of my hands. It was made for me. It was the realization that if I carry on pushing this, I'm going to do permanent damage. That's going to affect my quality of life for the rest of my life. And I don't want to do that to myself. I have a daughter. I have other responsibilities. So from that point of view, the decision was made for me. To be honest, it took me a while to wrestle with it. By the time I made that post and announced the decision, that felt like a weight off my shoulders, because up until that point in time, very few people knew what I was dealing with because I didn't have any answers myself. So it was very difficult to discuss it with other people because they had a lot of questions. I had a lot of questions. So it wasn't something that was easy for me to discuss. But making that post was almost cathartic in a sense. Then I could finally announce to the whole world, as it were, that this is what I've been dealing with. This is what's been going on for the last year. I haven't really said anything, not because I'm ashamed of getting bent, but there is that sense of that for a lot of people. I understand that. But it wasn't that. It was more the fact that, to begin with, I didn't think there was an issue. Then when it became clear there was an issue, I wanted to find out what the issue was and resolve it one way or the other and know which direction I was going in. And until I knew myself, I didn't really think that I wanted to go public with that. But once I've made the decision, which, as I said, was hard and took a long time to come to terms with, going public with it actually felt like a release. It felt like now I can tell everybody what's been going on. And to be honest, I was really touched by, a lot of the messages of support I got from everybody else. That was like really, really nice. And it also helped me as well to come to terms with my decision a little bit better. So from that point of view, do I miss diving? Yeah, sure, absolutely, 100%. I miss diving. I'm probably always going to miss it for the rest of my life. But it was clear at that point that that was the decision that I had to make. So I'd had a year of uncertainty. Now I'd come to a point where I actually knew what the decision was, and I knew, okay, there's a path forward. It's unfortunately not going to be diving, but at least I have some answers.
Yeah, it's super interesting from that perspective. And I know you wanted to investigate further and see if you could find some answers. Have you made any progress on that?
Yeah, so although, I announced my retirement from diving, and at this point in time, I do consider myself retired from diving, I haven't 100% closed the door, to be honest. And if I could find some underlying medical reason for why I was getting bent or the problems I was having, and if I could get that fixed, get it resolved, and if that gave me a path back to diving, I mean, I'm not talking about going back full-time, working professionally as a diver, because I think that chapter in my life is done and closed, but I still would like to have the opportunity, if at all possible, to make the occasional, recreational dive, fun dive, nothing extreme or serious, but just to be able to get back in the water. I've loved diving for a very, very long time. It is still my passion. So if I could do that, I want to, but not at the risk of my long-term health, obviously. So doing a lot more research and everything else, I discovered a lot of things about PFO tests, about shunts, not only heart shunts, but also pulmonary shunts and everything else. I also discovered that PFO tests can be unreliable, and that just having a single PFO test is not necessarily give you a clear answer or the correct answer. There's a lot of false negatives. So I made the decision that I was going to have some more testing done. So I was going to have a transesophageal echocardiogram and also a transcranial Doppler test as well. So as well as looking for heart shunts, they can also check for pulmonary shunts. Now, a heart shunt to a PFO can actually be fixed. That's a decision that if you find out you've got a PFO, you'd have to come to. Unfortunately, at this point in time, pulmonary shunts can't be fixed. So if it was that, there would be no way back. But I decided that I would have more testing done. I'd have a full battery because I just wanted to know for myself as well, out of curiosity. Because the fact that I was getting bent clearly indicates there is something going on. There is some underlying problem or medical condition. I have no idea at this point what it is, but it could affect me in other ways as well. So it's better knowing than not knowing. And one of the reasons for this trip to Europe, actually, apart from coming to see my daughter, was actually to get some more medical testing done. I was obviously thwarted by coronavirus because at that point in time, everything closed down. So all of the testing that I had planned to do, hoped to do, was basically shelved at that point in time. But I am still going to go ahead with that. So as things get back to normal, and as the clinics and hospitals start opening up to doing other procedures, obviously I understand they've got a backlog of people that are far more important than I am. I mean, there's nothing really wrong with me, so it might take a little bit longer until I can get the testing I want done. But I am hoping that while I'm in Europe, before I head back to Mexico, that I will have time to get some more tests done and hopefully learn more. Not knowing is not a great feeling. It's difficult to draw a line under it. Again, if you are clear one way or the other, okay, you have a PFO, you can get it fixed, or no, it's not a PFO, it's a lung shunt, you can't get that fixed. But at least then I have some clear answers.
Yeah, no, I understand that. I was going to relate earlier, and I'm very careful about making, comments about medical situations because I'm by no means qualified, but I did have a friend in Gozo who got consistently bent. I think she had 2 or 3 bends, and she had PFO tests which came up negative. And it was only when they put her on a bike, I think, at the end and really got her to work maximally on a bike, and while they were conducting the test, that they found the PFO and eventually repaired it. You certainly do get negative PFO tests when you in fact do have a PFO. That's possible. I know that for a fact. Well, mate, all the best with that. And at this point in time, it's going to be tricky, but over time, I'm sure if the answer's there to be found, then I wish you all the best to find it, because number 1, curiosity, number 2, you want to know, and number 3, if you can dive again, then that'd be amazing.
Yeah, exactly. And this whole experience, it's been a learning experience for me. So I learned a lot more about PFO tests and everything else, which I didn't know beforehand. And I would recommend that people who are intending to get into like technical diving, deeper mixed gas diving and everything else, if they haven't had a PFO test, it's probably something that's worthwhile doing. If someone has had an issue with decompression illness and they've had a PFO test and it's come back as negative, then maybe explore the possibility of getting more tests done. If you have all 3 tests done, then the chance of getting a false negative goes way, way down. It becomes really, really low. So they're 95%, they're going to find a PFO if you get all 3 tests done. Having only 1 test done, then the chance of false negative is actually quite high. And I didn't know these things beforehand. I only found them out through going through this process. My own personal opinion, and as I said, I still want to have the testing done. I want to know for sure one way or the other. But my own personal opinion is that, I've been diving for over 30 years. I've been full-time as a diver for 30 years. So that means that not just a recreational diver who's diving at the weekends, or a vacation diver who's diving a couple of times a year. I was in the water every day, day in, day out, all through the year. I was doing a lot of long dives. I was doing a lot of technical diving. I was doing a lot of decompression diving, especially more so in my early days of my diving career. And I think that over a period of time, you build up wear and tear. It doesn't matter what you do. If you do it to an extreme, and I would say that for sure that I was diving, an extreme amount over a certain number of years, you are going to accumulate some underlying damage. And then you couple that with age, and just the general deleterious effects that has on the body. There is a good chance that you just reach a point where your body says, that's enough. We can't do it anymore. And it's interesting because, I had a lot of messages and conversations with people who had experienced the same type of scenario that I was going through. And that was interesting to me because when this was happening to me, I was like, I understand what's going on, because I don't know anybody else who's been dealing with this. And in actual fact, there are a lot of people that sort of ticked all the same boxes that I was in. They were professional divers, right, in the recreational industry, but they were instructors. They've been diving for a very long time, like 20, 30, 40 years. They were getting up there in terms of age. They were in their 50s and 60s. All of a sudden, they started having problems with unexplained bends. And they were, at that point, diving fairly conservatively. They'd had tests done and everything else. They were coming back as negative for PFOs, and yet they were getting bent on dives they should not have been getting bent on. And they were effectively retiring from diving because of this, but they weren't public personas so much. They didn't have a public platform. So whereas maybe their close friends, diving buddies, and family knew what was going on, the wider diving world was not aware of the fact that there is this group of people, and actually I think it's far larger than people realize, of divers who are getting on a bit, who are retiring quietly from diving because they're now starting with DCI at a later age in life because of all this damage accumulated over a long period of time. And I think this is a group of divers or a subset of people who are suffering DCI that have never really been studied. I don't find anything in the literature. I don't find any studies that have been done. There's not even any awareness of it. But as soon as I posted my story, so many people contacted me to say, yeah, exactly the same thing happened to me. And I stopped diving. And I'm like, okay, wow, no, it isn't just me. There are many other people out there who've been through the same thing. We just haven't heard about it. And so that's another reason to get this information out there, is because I've always been an educator, and I think it's important to be transparent and open with this stuff. And I also think it's important because the more knowledge we get out there into the diving database, the better. And it's unfortunate that a lot of people have slipped under the radar over the years, and people haven't been more aware of this, because I think that it can change diver behavior to a certain extent. Again, conversations I've had with a lot of divers, for a lot of them, reading my story was a little bit of a wake-up call for them, and they thought a little bit more about, what they're doing, how often they're diving, how many rest days they're taking, and how conservative they need to be, particularly if they're getting up there in age and everything else.
Yeah, one thing I found really interesting, I think I heard this on another video session that you did, was talking about the fact that a lot of the dives you were doing were relatively shallow dives, but long duration and had a sawtooth profile. And most of us think that those sort of dives are relatively benign. Of course, you do your deco, but we think there's a more danger or a lot more caution should be taken about a deeper, even a bounce dive type, looking at trimix, those sort of dives. But I think you were alluding to the fact that we need to be really careful about these long duration shallow dives as well.
No, absolutely. So that was going to be my second point. One is your dive history. So it's just like, how long have you been doing this and how much have you been doing it? Okay. So that definitely in my mind is a factor. And the second thing is, what type of diving are you actually doing? And is that perhaps opening you up to unintended consequences? And yes, we tend to think of sort of like the deep bounce mixed gas dives as being sort of like the ones that we have to be cautious of, the ones that are dangerous. But if you look at the medical statistics, if you look at DCI statistics, the groups that are most likely to get bent are the divers doing fairly shallow dives, but that have sawtooth profiles. So diving instructors, for example, teaching open water courses that are doing multiple dives a day, not particularly long duration, not particularly deep, but they're doing lots of ascents during the dive. Or the other group of divers that get bent even more than dive masters and instructors are fish farm divers.
Yes.
Typically, they're not diving very deep. It's pretty shallow, but they're doing lots and lots of diving in a day, so multiple ascents. Well, I remember reading years and years ago an article, a Dan article, that recommended no more than 3 ascents in only 1 day's diving. And by ascent, they didn't mean all the way from the bottom to the surface. They meant any significant depth change during the dive. Go down, you stay at depth, and then you work gradually back to the surface at the end of your dive, and you don't do any more than 3 of those during a particular day of diving. And I remember thinking at the time, because I was diving in Mexico, okay, right. I do 30, 40 ascents in any one dive, because the caves, by their nature, you have to follow the profile of the cave. You can't we'll know is healthier for you, better for you, that you go down to your maximum depth, you stay there, or you work gradually slower, and then you come back up again. Well, the cave doesn't allow you to do that. You're going up and down constantly. So although the caves aren't deep, for the Mexican caves, the ones I'm diving in, 15 to 20 meters maximum depth, average depths of sort of like 8 to 12 meters, but you are constantly going up and down. Anyone who's done a cavern tour in Taj Mahal, for example, knows what that's like. I mean, you're down at 12, 14 meters, then you're back up pretty much to the surface, then you're back down, then you're back up again. And the caves maybe not quite as extreme as some of the cavern dives, but you are making a lot of ascents and descents during the dive, and you have to go through the cavern zone on the way in, on the way out. If you look at my dive profiles, they look like a seismograph during an earthquake. And that's for everybody who's diving in that environment. Now, I think everybody's aware of that. We're all aware that none of the tables, none of the decompression models are based on that type of diving, sort of very long dives, although they're shallow, but with very aggressive sawtooth profiles. So, we know, okay, ascend nice and slowly, but still over a period of time, if you're doing sort of like a 3, 4, 5, even longer diving, which you can do because the caves are shallow, you've got a significant inert gas load. And now you're doing all of these ascents where there's a good chance you're going to get some microbubble formation going on. And you're doing that repeatedly throughout the dive. And then you may be doing 1 or 2 dives a day, possibly more. Although, the last few years of my diving career, I was diving less, but diving longer. But you're doing multiple days of diving, one after the other. And so this can potentially build up, or at least I think that the damage that you do is a cumulative thing. So whereas you could go off and do a deep mixed gas dive and miss some deco or have a rapid ascent or have some problem, and now you get a lot of damage done very quickly in a short period of time. What I think with this is it's small, cumulative damage, incremental over a very long period of time, which eventually is obviously going to show up And you get to the point where the final straw breaks the camel's back and anything is going to push you over the edge. People think of decompression illness as being a hard, fast line in the sand, where if you stand on one side of that line, you're not bent. If you stand on the other side of the line, you are bent. And it's not really like that. Every single time you go diving, you're exposing yourself to decompression stress. Now, the amount of decompression stress that your body is exposed to could mean that you come out no symptoms whatsoever, or it could mean that you've got so much stress that you've got overt signs and symptoms and you have to go to a chamber and get treated for it. But there's that gray area in between those two states where you are suffering decompression stress on the body, but you're not getting overt signs and symptoms. But that does not mean that there is not underlying damage happening. And if you're doing that over and over and over again, eventually you get to the point where your body says, okay, enough, I can't do it anymore. And as I was saying before, it doesn't matter what you do. If you do it to extremes, if you're a professional footballer, if you're a typist, if you're a ballerina, you're putting stress on your body that your body is not really designed to cope with. If you just go out and play football at the weekends, no problem. But if you're playing football every single day, over a period of time, your joints start to wear down, you start to have problems. That's why we don't have professional footballers in their 40s, in their 50s anymore, because their bodies have worn out. They can't physically do it anymore. So maybe the same is true for professional divers, the type of people who are working full-time in the industry and diving all the time. Unless they're taking good care of themselves over all of the time through their diving career, the chances are that the damage they do may actually come back to bite them in later life. And I definitely think that it is probably what's happened to me. As I said, I still want to have more testing done. I still want to find out if there are any underlying health or medical reasons, but it just might be the fact that I wore my body out with the amount of diving that I did over the years. Even though I tried to dive as conservatively as possible, but just the nature of the environment I was diving in and the fact that I'm getting older and the amount of diving I've done, that may have been enough just to, basically wear my body out to the extent where it says enough is enough.
Yeah, thanks very much for sharing. I mean, it's a really interesting sort of insight into what a diver goes through over that period of time when you're diving to the extent that you are. And maybe there's a takeout of that. And I don't know how real it is in terms of implementing something like this, but as you kind of segment your dive career, you say, hey, I'm in my 20s and 30s, I can pretty much go for it. And this is the time that I'm like a professional sportsman, right? This is the time I can go for it. This is the time when I'm going to achieve it. And then as you come into your 40s, 50s and 60s and so on, you have to really say, well, look, I've got to back this off. I've got to take days off. I've got to make my profiles much more conservative. But I mean, you said you did that. So it's got to be the sheer volume of dives has to really back off, doesn't it?
Yeah, but again, it comes back to, hindsight is 20/20. So if I look back over my diving career for the last, 5 or 6 years, I was getting more physically tired after diving. At the time, I just put that down to the fact I'm getting older, and in general, things are more difficult. If I go to the gym and do a workout, I don't recover as fast from it. But was it actually not so much the aging process, and more it was just the underlying stress I was putting my body on? But whereas 10 years ago, I might dive 30 days straight in a row, I'd probably be wiped out at the end of that, both physically and mentally. The last few years, I've been making sure that I was always taking days off. So I would always, in any 1 week of diving, I would always have 2 days off. And I was actually scheduling days off, because if you don't schedule them, they get filled up.
Yes.
So you have to be kind of strict about it. I was cutting down the number of dives I was doing in a day. And that was partly because of where my interest was, where my specialty was, and the type of stuff that I was doing. So rather than doing 2 or 3 dives a day, I would be only doing 1 or potentially 2 dives a day. In fact, it got to the point where I never did more than 2 dives in any one day's diving. So I'd far rather do 1 longer dive than 2 shorter dives with a surface interval.
Yeah.
So another change that over the last sort of 5 or 10 years of my diving career, I was doing a lot more dives with a DPV than I was doing swimming dives. So on one side, that cuts your exertion down, which is probably a good thing. Although most of the time when you're cave diving, you're not really exerting yourself, or you shouldn't be anyway if you're doing it properly. But the downside of using a scooter, particularly in the environment that I was diving in, is that it's too easy to stay on the trigger and ignore or blow past small ascents. Yeah, I mean, we're all human. I mean, we all get to the point where it's like, it's only a couple of meters, I don't need to come off the trigger for that. And you tend to scooter stuff that you probably shouldn't, where you should actually stop the scooter and you should make a slower swimming ascent. So even though with a scooter you try to flatten things out, you'll go around objects rather than over the top and all the rest of it. Once you're on the trigger, scooter's a lot of fun. It's hard to come off the trigger. So I think as much as the scooter probably minimized to a certain extent exertion for certain dives, particularly longer stage dives, carrying multiple stage bottles, and that's hard work, swimming against, even light flow, which we have in Mexico. But if you're carrying 3 or 4 stages, and you're swimming upstream in the Hot Cheech, for example, it's hard work. And you take a scooter and now there's no physical exertion anymore. But at the same time, now you're probably exceeding ascent rates, or you're going faster than you would if you were swimming. So that's a double-edged sword. It's a great tool, but it needs to be used carefully. One of the things that I did early on in my diving career in Mexico is I actually stopped breathing air at all, and I would only use nitrox. I actually think that probably helped to an extent, but I actually don't think for this type of diving, nitrox perhaps helps as much as I thought it did at the time, and as much as other people think it does as well. Because yes, does it cut down on your inert gas loading? Yes, it does. But to be honest, the caves are so shallow that wasn't so much the issue. Again, it's more the ascents and descents and microbubble formation and everything else. And the nitrox won't really make any difference to that. And the problem is that once your tissues are saturated with oxygen, which they are going to be if you're using nitrox and you're doing longer dives, then, when you have bubbles or when you get bubble growth, then excess oxygen in the tissues can enter those bubbles and cause them to expand as well. It's not just inert gases that create bubbles and cause bubble growth. Oxygen can do the same. Now, yes, we know oxygen is a metabolically active gas. So if you have oxygen in bubbles and your body needs it, it will take that oxygen, it will metabolize it. So that would shrink the bubbles. But if you're already super saturated with oxygen and you don't need any of the oxygen that's in the bubbles, it doesn't go anywhere. Your body doesn't metabolize it because it doesn't need it. So the idea that just using nitrox is a panacea or cure-all, I think is not the case. And I probably thought that the nitrox was being a lot more helpful than it maybe really is in this particular environment and for the type of diving that I was doing. I'm not saying that breathing nitrox isn't good. I think it is, and I think all people doing the type of diving I was doing in the environment I was in should be using nitrox. But bear in mind that it's probably not helping that much.
Interesting. Thank you very much, Steve. It's been really great to catch up. One last question before we go is, so what do you got planned for the future right now? So obviously diving is out for the moment. What are you doing now?
It is. So at the moment, I'm in London. I am in the process of remodeling my mum's house. She's getting on a bit. So she just needs to have some sort of mobility aids put in. So I'm in the process of doing her bathroom at the moment. I'm going to be heading back to Mexico probably September time. I'm actually heading over to Switzerland at the end of August to give a presentation at a dive show over there. For the future, what I want to be doing is I actually want to be traveling and speaking more, doing seminars and workshops and talks and things. And I was supposed to do one earlier this year out in China, but unfortunately with the current situation that had to be cancelled. Hopefully that once things get more back to normal, I'll be heading over to China to actually attend a dive show and do a presentation at that. And so if anyone out there would like me to travel and give a presentation, do a workshop, I'm happy to do so. I have a lot more time to do that now.
And still a lot to share too, huh?
Enjoying doing that. Yeah, and I enjoy sharing it. I mean, although I'm not diving anymore, I do have over 30 years of diving experience to draw on, and I still enjoy being an educator and everything else. The other thing I'm working on at the moment is I'm actually working on a book.
I was about to say, that was my suggestion for you.
Yeah, and many people have suggested that over the years. And to be honest, while I was still diving, I was too busy. But now I'm not. Then it's time to just maybe put some of this stuff down in writing. So working on a book. We'll see how that goes. Let's see if anyone wants to read it. Yeah, those projects are keeping me fairly busy at the moment.
Do you have a title yet?
I do, but I don't want to. I don't want to release.
Fair enough. Keep your powder dry. All right. In fact, there it is. There's your title.
That would be a good one. It's not that. It would be a good one.
Keep that as a backup. My gift to you, mate.
Thank you very much. That's a great title for a rebreather book.
Exactly. Well, hey, Steve, great to catch up, and thanks so much for sharing. It worried me when I was reaching out to you because I know you've been sharing your story a lot, and sometimes you wonder whether you get sick of doing that, and we're sick of asking the same questions. But it is a great story to relate, and I think there's a lot of lessons in there especially for those of us who are getting a little older and who are dive professionals. I think there's certainly some lessons there in terms of managing your body and making sure that you can look after yourself. And then I never get tired of the stories. That Dan's Cave one is awesome. So thanks very much for sharing that. It was great to catch up. I hope we can meet in person sometime, and all the best.
Steve, it was real fun talking to you, and I can't dive anymore, but I still do enjoy talking about it. And if any of my experiences can help other people, I'm really happy for that as well. So yeah, it's been fun to do. And as I said, if anyone out there would like me to attend a dive show, give a seminar, presentation, workshop, happy to do that. New Zealand, Australia, wherever it happens to be.
What's the best way to reach out to you?
Via email, steve@sidemount.com, or via Facebook, via Messenger on Facebook.
Okay. I'll post both of those in the podcast notes, so no worries. All right. Well, thanks very much, Steve. We'll catch you soon.
Thanks, Steve. Good talking with you. Bye.
Well, I hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I did making it. It was phenomenal to catch up with Steve again, and a little bit heart-wrenching to go through his story of how he's experienced several episodes of DCS and what it's meant for his diving future. I'm sure there'll be something down the track for Steve somewhere, and his continued involvement in diving is just going to be awesome for all of us, and I hope that we can catch up with him somewhere in the world at one of the many conferences he'll be speaking at. Now, if you enjoyed this episode, don't miss episode 56, the premium patron-only episode. It's available through www.patreon.com. There is a segment that I put up on YouTube specifically on the Dan and Ralph's Cave connection and the experience that Steve had trying to exit the cave through a vertical, no mount, no visibility restriction. Just an awesome story, so don't miss that. Thanks so much again to X-Deep and all of our patrons. If you'd like to become a patron of Speaking Sidemount, don't forget, head over to www.patreon.com/speakingsidemount. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll catch you in the next episode.
You've been listening to Speaking Sidemount from www.sidemountpros.com. If you like the podcast, please subscribe and consider leaving us a 5-star review. If there's something you'd like us to cover on the show, then let us know via our Facebook page listed in the podcast notes. Thanks again, and we look forward to you joining us on our next episode of Speaking Sidemount.